Welcome back. Dean Obeidallah Show. We're live here Wednesday, April 10th. The people on hold, we're going to take time for calls later. I promise you. Right now, though, very happy to have back on. It's been too long. Terrell Jermaine Starr, a journalist who covers foreign policy, writes for Black Diplomats newsletter, also Black Diplomats official YouTube channel. And he was on a couple of times, once live from Ukraine. We had you on before the war began. So that's 2 years and about a month ago. And then once, I think, during the war. And thanks for being on. Good to see you, my friend.
Yeah, same here, man. It's too long. Definitely need to be on more often.
Definitely. That's fine. I know you're going to go back to Ukraine. You were just telling me before we started in May, but let's fill people in a little bit because Ukraine gets some coverage. Right now, all the coverage is generally about Republicans stopping aid. But what's going on the ground there? It's 2 years and 2 months since Russia's brutal invasion of a democratic nation of Ukraine. What's the situation in terms of Ukraine military and Russian military on the ground?
Well, militarily, the main thing is that they are able to hold. We realized back in 2022, when the invasion began, that Ukraine does have the ability and, most importantly, the will to resist. And so a lot of the draw was, can Ukraine hold? And barring the territory that has not regained since the initial months, Ukraine has regained 50% of the territory that Russia has occupied from the start of the 2022 invasion. But what we're dealing with right now is the shortages of arms, particularly the 155 millimeter rounds that Ukraine needs in order to fend off Russian advances. That also deals with air defense systems. You've heard a lot about the attacks on civilian infrastructure, particularly the energy sector, and also just people's apartment buildings. When I was there, I was almost killed several times along with other Ukrainians because the Russians target the civilian locations. And so you're dealing with a severe shortage of necessary air defense systems that would cover the whole country to fend off this very aggressive Russian offensive, which is designed to force Ukraine to quit. And so there's a standstill. Without additional aid, Ukraine will be very difficult for Ukraine to move forward in order to defend itself and recover the land that Russia has stolen.
Early in the war, there was a massive refugee issue where people were fleeing to Poland and other neighboring countries. What has gone on now, 2 years plus? Have any people been able to come home? Have they been living their lives in other nations now? What can you share?
Yeah, so there are two storylines with that. You have the story of the Ukrainians who were fleeing, and then you have the story of the Africans and the people of color who also fled into Europe. So the story with the Ukrainians, they're millions of people. There are estimates of upwards of 6 million, 7 million people who fled, and most of those people, so most of those people have gone to Poland. And also keep in mind that there are many more people who have been internally displaced, who are no longer in their homes, primarily in the east and the south, and many of them moved further west into central Ukraine and into the Western Carpathian Mountain regions and other parts of Western Ukraine. So with those people who fled for the European Union, that situation is pretty challenging, particularly with Poland, where those two countries, Poland and Ukraine, they have very tense ties for a bunch of reasons I can't get into for the time of this show, but had this great unity when the Russian invasion began. But as most countries deal with immigration, even in the best of circumstances, you have this challenge of how these new arrivals are taxing the current infrastructure that wasn't prepared to receive them. And then you deal with many of the types of negative reactions that you have from a host country's population when you have newly arrived migrants or immigrants who are perceived to have overstayed their welcome. And so a lot of people I personally know left Poland and other countries and returned to Ukraine because, one, they just couldn't find work. Two, it's very difficult being a refugee. It's not an easy life. Some people
No.
can never stay. Some people can never leave the camps and get into proper housing, and so they end up going back to Ukraine and adjusting because they realize that, oh, our guys are able to hold, because a lot of people thought that much of the country would be occupied when they realized that there's a chance that they can actually that their soldiers can fight. There's a degree of safety that they felt there. Now, when you're dealing with the African students, the Indian students, for example, they've had a much challenging adjustment, starting with racism. Okay, so with the racism, yes. That starts off with the fact that their refugee status was not honored going across the borders. You have people who are strip searched, accused of trafficking drugs. I've had a number of interviews with these people. They told me that personally. And if you go to a country like Germany, for example, where the country determines your refugee status on a state by state basis, it is not centralized. As a refugee who doesn't have the language skills, and you hope that people speak English, and also a lot of the people who come from Ukraine, they're francophone, and many of them may not even have English to speak with. That becomes a very challenging situation because their presence is not welcome there because they're Black or because they're a person of color. And so that's a very untold story that I'm doing work on right now and raising funds for to better tell. But the situation for refugees right now, in a nutshell, for all of those people, I would say is very precarious.
I'm talking about Terrell Jermaine Starr, journalist, covers foreign policy, and especially Ukraine, because he lives there a chunk of the time and lives back here in the States. How are it's 2 years and 2 months into a war, and living in that conditions for people, I don't mean the ones on the battlefield, I mean the average Ukrainian who's living there, they still have to pay their bills. I'm sure they work when they can. And then there's ever times where Russia then starts firing missiles at civilian targets. We see that, which is unnerving. Well, how are the spirits and the resilience of the Ukraine people?
Well, it depends on where you live. The closer you are to the settlements that's at the zero line where the conflict is, you hear explosions, outgoing, and unfortunately incoming. It's a very fearful life that you deal with electrical shortages, shortages when it comes to things like water because the infrastructure is being destroyed. Now, if the town is liberated, stores can get food. All that stuff is not necessarily an issue because as long as the country is as this town is liberated, then goods can get to it. So that part is not the issue. The challenge is dealing with the unpredictability of whether or not air defense systems can stop all of the Iranian drones and Russian drones and North Korean ballistic missiles that are being fired at them on a daily basis. And we, whether it's Kharkiv or whether it is Zaporizhia or Odessa or even in Ukraine or elsewhere, that's very dangerous. And some of those missiles, unfortunately, get through and people are killed. You hear stories about that every day. In fact, in March, there was a significant increase in the number of deaths that come from ballistic missiles that target civilian locations. So it can be a very it could be a very anxiety-inducing situation. But I'll say that the resilience of the people there is unrelenting. And as somebody who lives in Ukraine part-time, I'm going back in May, as a matter of fact. I'm going to stay for a month or so before I return again. The life there goes as normally as it can be. That means that if there is a grocery store that can be open, it's open. If there is a opera that is performing, the opera season's going on, all these things happen. And so in a place like Kyiv, a lot of the clubs that you would go to, the bars, whatever activities that you would see around New York City, you can find much of that stuff in Kyiv. The only difference is that there's martial law, and so everything shuts down around 9 or 10 o'clock, and so it just looks like a ghost town. When I returned from Kyiv late last year and was walking around New York City, at 9 o'clock in the evening, it felt surreal because I said, wow, all these people, because in Kyiv, you pretty much don't see anyone because there's no place to go because everyone is preparing for the 12 o'clock martial law that's going to be enforced. And so on one end, you got the dangers of the ballistic missiles and the drones strikes, which I've witnessed myself. And then on the other hand, you have people who are very much living relatively normal lives in ways that the two of us and the listeners would experience, but you just have that specter of danger that could be coming from Russia or from the Black Sea at any moment, and that's a missile strike.
It's amazing how people get used to circumstances again, because you have to survive, or not just survive, you have to go about your business and live your life. Like, you're going to put it on hold. No one knows how long this war is going to continue. You know, alarmingly, on Monday, Ukrainian President Zelensky said, I believe it's on CNN, Ukraine, quote, will lose this war if the U.S. Congress does not approve military aid. And he said millions could die in terms of the Ukraine, people in Ukraine, if U.S. lawmakers don't approve the aid package. When you know what's going on, you've been there, what's your reaction to this?
Well, he's telling the truth. And so basically the main things that they need right now are air defense systems, and they need and also the interceptors for those air defense systems, because Russia is striking Ukraine at an alarming rate because they know that the country is running critically low on air defense systems and the ability to shoot down drones and to shoot down and to shoot down incoming missiles. They know that the Ukrainians are running critically low on artillery shells, the 155 millimeter in particular, that they can use to repel Russian advances. And so there's also this challenge of the U.S. and the West responding late. And that basically means the F-16s that are arriving right now, they would have been better used had they arrived much sooner at the start of the war. And so, as we know, and so that's what he means. So when the millions are dying, he's starting with the thousands of people who could be impacted by these missile strikes that they can't defend themselves against. That's at a very basic level. And so, and they also talk about the fear of changing situations on the ground where there could be a breakthrough in one settlement that can lead to 5 or 6 or 7, and the Ukrainians are left without any significant incoming aid coming that could re-up. They're also dealing with this, and you didn't discuss this, but it's very important. The Russians have far more people to throw at Ukraine than Ukraine has to defend themselves. And so you're dealing with a country of 150 million roughly in Russia. And pre-war, Ukraine was about 45 million people. And so the age of conscription in Ukraine is 27 years old. There's a robust debate of whether or not to lower that age, because in many countries it's 18. At the time when we had conscription here, it was 18 as well. And we remember that during the Vietnam War. So they're dealing with all these dynamics, and you're dealing with a democratic country that is weighing whether or not this is going to be politically popular to lower the age so that they can at least refresh the people who are the soldiers in Ukraine who are in their 30s and 40s and fighting beyond their prime, right? With younger people versus Putin's Russia, where it's authoritarian and he can do whatever he wants. And he also relies on these authoritarian leaders in Iran and North Korea that can replenish them with arms. Whereas with the West, they're kind of twiddling their thumbs and figuring out. So that's the main difference that you see. And that's the fear that Zelensky is speaking to.
Yeah, and I'm glad you share that. And you could fill in anything. If I don't ask a question and you think something's important on this, I want listeners, look, in the beginning, we covered this a lot, that the 1-year anniversary, we covered it. But now we haven't talked about Ukraine as much, except for the politics of it. And what we're seeing, and Congressman Mike Turner, a Republican, sort of like an old school Republican, literally on Sunday accused fellow Republicans of parroting Russia talking points. Talk about Marjorie Taylor Greene specifically. There's others, Tommy Tuberville, the senator from Alabama. You have when you hear these Republicans who are opposing aid and literally repeating Russian talking points, what does that tell you?
It tells me that that like Putin's Russia, they don't want democracy. We spend so much time talking about preserving democracy on the Democratic side without really acknowledging the fact that the MAGA contingency within the Republican Party, and I would dare to say even beyond the MAGA contingency within the Republican Party, there are many of these people who don't want democratic institutions to exist because if true, powerful, and fair democratic institutions exist, they will lose their power. And so that's what this is primarily about. At the ballot box, if there's fair access, they lose. And this is not being biased politically. These are just facts, you know. And so basically, what you're dealing with these Putin-esque type of elected officials in the GOP is that you see folks who wish that our country, the United States, would be authoritarian, and I would even say totalitarian in the light of Russian President Vladimir Putin. And with Trump, what he sees is somebody that he wish he could be like, but he can't, because our democratic institutions are so strong that they won't allow him to turn this country into a kleptocracy in the way that he turned the Oval Office into a kleptocracy during his 4 years in office. And so I always explain the similarities between Vladimir Putin and Trump and by describing the political trinity. And so what's very similar with both of these people and their grab of power, they have several things in common. They coalesce, they gather power around the far right. They generate power around the church, and they generate power at the state level, right? And so with Putin, he has the Orthodox Church, which is pretty much an arm of the FSB. And that's not me being, that's not hyperbole. That's fact. You can legitimately Google and see how their top leadership were caught for being spies. That's absolutely true. Then you have the far right in Russia, which the late Alexei Navalny was actually entertained in his rise to popularity before his untimely death. And then for the past several decades, Putin has controlled the Kremlin. And if he lives through his next term, then he will have taken power in Russia longer than Stalin. And with Trump, what you have is you have the white evangelicals that have a penchant for nationalist violence and has done so. And then you also have the far right, and my biggest memory of them was 2017 when they really showed their behinds with Jews will not replace us, those folks, the Charlottesville folks. So, and you have the Proud Boys and all these other folks. So it's the far right. And then for one term, he had control of the state. And so he didn't have the control that he wanted because our democratic institutions are so strong, which is why he is using the courts that he feel will go in his favor, and ironically did not go in his favor in 2020 when he tried to overturn the elections, right? That's what he was trying to do. And so when I talk about this deeper issue beyond MAGA, we can go back to the early 2010s when the Supreme Court then struck down a key part of the Voter Rights Act that disempowers the Justice Department from checking to ensure that local elections at the state level are not violating people's civil rights, right? And so I'm saying all of this, and why it ties to Ukraine is that when we talk about foreign policy, right? When we talk about foreign policy in Ukraine, we would never talk about domestic politics, because domestic politics were directed towards people like me and people like you, people who come from these backgrounds where they're not, where they're not white, they don't have a background of whiteness, they're not the Latinx community, they're not these quote unquote Mexicans that are coming in and invading us, right? And so the thing with Ukraine that sticks out is that it's not America first. Even though much of the aid that will be that's going to Ukraine, that will be preparing these rounds and all this other weaponry, is going to support American companies and American factory workers to make them to send to Ukraine. It's not like the buckets of cash or the suitcases of cash are going to Ukraine. It doesn't work that way. But who cares about facts anymore, especially in this disinformation world that we're living in? So for the first time, and I tell this to a lot of my Ukrainian colleagues, I say, you come to my country, and there is a time where you can navigate our spaces, integrate into whiteness, and go to these white think tanks and go to these white mixers and talk about things, right? And never talk to any Black people, and you don't learn about this country. Now, and the biggest irony in all of this is that it's really white nationalism that is hijacking Ukraine's sovereignty and threatening it. That's what the Marjorie Taylors of the world are doing, the Mike Johnsons of the world are doing. And it's simply because this is not going to the American homeland, which is nothing more than the American white people who feel like their whiteness is being devalued. We feel like we need a bigger piece of that pie. And how dare you send our piece of the pie to those people over there that who Putin feels are a threat to him. Right. And so that's where these connections are going. And if you don't understand race in this country, you don't understand America, you don't understand US politics. And it's really going to be a deep barrier to prevent you from understanding all these connections that need to be made. Because here's the bottom line in closing on this point is that if we in America don't understand it, they certainly will. That's why Tucker Carlson goes over to Russia and interviews Putin. That's why he has this good relationship with Viktor Orban in Hungary. They understand that globally and together, they can coalesce around their whiteness. That's why you have Marine Le Pen in France, who continues to be a threat for the presidential campaigns every term, because it's an issue of our whiteness is being devalued. From a global scale, they have this. At the national level here in the United States, we don't have an alternative on the Democratic side to combat it, because they're not facing the harsh truths of how racism and white supremacy are not only tearing this country apart, it's going to tear this world apart, and it's impacting Ukraine in ways that they or anyone who's in my field ever thought about.
That's an amazing explanation. I'm telling you, with Terrell Jermaine Starr, a journalist focused on foreign policy. So when you look at, in your view, is this a way for a new global or to preserve a global order by when you see Orban and Trump likes Orban and he has an affinity towards Putin? Is it just the strongman part of it, or is it also the white supremacy part of it, and they intertwined?
It's both. You have to remember that David Duke and other white nationalists were going to Russia in the 1990s. Again, I want your listeners to go on Google and search all this stuff. David Duke, Russia, 1990s. Far American white supremacists, Russia, 1990s. This is something that's always been happening, because even as you have to remember that the Russia occupied 1/6 of the world, and you don't get that by being unless you're a genocidal imperial entity, which is what the Soviet Union was, and which is what the Russian and the Russian Empire was before that, and what the Russian Federation is not. Russian Federation is, in its lesser variance from the previous two political entities, is now. So they've always had a penchant for attracting white supremacists in America and in the West, because it very much aligned with how they colonized their part of the world. So this is nothing particularly new. And anyone who focuses on this subject will tell you that. The problem that you run into in this field, and I say this as somebody who was the first Black person from the University of Illinois to get a master's degree in Russian, East European, and Eurasian studies, and one of the first Black people. Unfortunately, I want more to apply for Fulbright and Peace Corps. I want everyone, if you have, if you're a professional apply for these programs. We need more people of color there. But I'm bringing this up because this field lacks they lack the diverse minds and non-white people who have the personal experience to see these trends here in the United States and how they can translate globally. And I think that this is a major national security issue because I can't be and it's a national security issue because we don't see that what's happening here is percolating globally. And so all of these groups have been working together for the past decades, and they've just been waiting for their American counterpart to take a national stage. And that's Donald Trump, because these national figures, these national kind of right-wing white supremacist figures have been taking hold in Europe and other parts of the world for decades. We've had conservatives, we've had people, you can say that they're racist, but not in the form of Trump, where he just says who's just verbally saying that we're just going to just dismantle any democratic institutions. They're saying the silent part out very loud, and we need people who are able to draw these parallels. And that's the number one thing that we're missing. And until we get more people in positions of power who understand this, then not only are they going to miss these dynamics of white supremacists coalescing around each other, they're going to misunderstand and miscalculate how this is impacting Ukraine. Because I'm telling you, and I can't say this enough, I have many Eastern European colleagues who come over here and they never have to learn about our racial dynamics. And they only come because they integrate into whiteness. And they don't, and they don't realize that it is this very white supremacist construct that's been impacting people of color for years that's now getting in the way of challenging their sovereignty.
And it's interesting how you bring it together, and you mentioned that trinity of power, one part being the church, and it's actually perfect timing in a way. Donald Trump said today, and it's kind of new. He touched on it like a week ago, but he said it again today. He said, I predict November 5th, which is election day, the most important day in the history of our country, and it's going to be Christian Visibility Day. Christian Visibility Day, he repeats. Christians are going to come out and they're going to vote like never before. So, and that's an interesting new line. It's it's very, very clear. And at the same time, yesterday he was talking about Jewish Americans. If you don't vote for him, you should be, quote, spoken to, which I'm like, and my friends are Jewish. They're like, that's kind of alarming for us, because spoken to, and you think of the Charlottesville, you mean like the Charlottesville people, the ones chanting Jews will not replace us, those you want them to speak to us. So it's a different, like, he's in our face. And again, today, it doesn't get, when Trump speaks, like on the tarmac today, you can spend days breaking down each of the things he says, from stuff about the elections to the criminal cases. But sometimes my eyes go to the Christian nationalist stuff. It's not really Christian, but that's what we call it academically, and stuff about religion and dividing more. Because again, that's a fascist tool to divide people against each other. They do it all the time. And the victim is always the group, the biggest group. They're the victim somehow. And that gives them the permission to oppress and even kill minorities. So when you hear Trump saying election day is going to be Christian Visibility Day and Christians are going to come out like never before, what does that say to you?
He speaks with the same language that any totalitarian person, or in this case, wannabe totalitarian individual speaks with. You can go back to Hitler, you can go back to any far right extremist person that uses the church as a narcotic in order to lure people into their belief systems. The church has a very, very outsized level of influence in our society, and it can be for good and for evil. And so what we're thinking about here is that the white evangelicals that are coalescing around him are really going back to the genesis of how they think Christianity ought to be used in the first place, which is to subjugate other people who are not white. If you go back to slavery, any slavery scholar will tell you that one of the main intellectual justifications that slaveholders use was that the Holy Bible says that this is the right thing to do. Okay,
And Jim Crow too, right? And they use the Bible for Jim
and,
Crow.
and Jim Crow, some of the most devout white supremacists are people who can quote the Bible from cover to cover. All right. And so that part is something that should not at all surprise us. Now, what we really have to realize is that there are several ironies out of that. And I say this, as somebody who graduated from a historically Black college that was co-founded in part by white evangelicals, it wasn't always that way. Reverend William Barber will tell you that way, that with HBCUs were started in the mid to late 1800s. They were started by newly freed Black folk and white evangelicals that worked together. But unfortunately, in the mid 1900s, when money got involved into it, it just completely changed the dynamic of evangelicalism. Now, there's also another thing here that's equally important, which is in the next few decades, there are a number of studies that talk about how white people will no longer be the majority and they'll become the minority. And
a minority,
yeah, exactly. And so what's important is that you have a lot of people, Asian Americans, Black folk, Latinx community, who also are believers, but but they're not, they don't fit into this white supremacist, this white evangelical racism interpretation of the Bible. And so these white evangelicals are keenly aware of this. They see themselves as being erased. And so they may not be saying that quote unquote Jews will not replace us, which is another irony because it was happening in Gaza. You have a bunch of white evangelicals that say that they're pro-Israel, even though they don't care about Jews. That's a whole nother story. I don't know if you want to ask about that.
That's a whole thing.
Okay, but basically what you have is that you have these white evangelicals who are saying that these people will replace us, or it may not be Jews that's replacing them, but it's the Asian, it's the Black person, it is the Latinx person, it's it's the Arab American person that they see that's coming in, that's going to mix with their family, and they don't want that. And so the person who is the bulwark between that happening and them preserving who they think they are is Donald Trump. And if we really don't come with the same vigor of survival as they do, they will. If they may not, what they'll do is that they'll just make our lives a living hell. They want to take us back as far to Jim Crow as possible, where women don't have the right to choose their bodies, where LGBTQ people will be under constant attack. That's where they want to take us, and they are fighting with every last breath, and we have to come back with the same energy and also the organizational capacity to do so. And that kind of leads us into the larger problem with Gaza.
I do want to touch on that before we wrap up on Ukraine. But this morning, I was mentioning earlier on the show, I went to the National Action Network convention, Reverend Al's convention. He has it for a few days, and I always go for the first day, and I interview people there. And their theme this year is "We won't go back." That's their theme on everything. And when I spoke to Black people, they were very palpable, very grave concern that right now they're facing a movement that wants to take them back to a time, no voting rights, to even a Jim Crow, not exactly like Jim Crow. We understand that, but somewhere moving back on issue after issue for various communities. But they know as Black Americans, they'll be in the crosshairs of these white supremacists. That's who they always focus on. So it's interesting that you mentioned about going back. I'm chatting with Terrell Jermaine Starr. So one quick thing on Ukraine, then one quick thing on Gaza, and then I'll let you go. It's nice chatting with you. So what would be a turning point in this war for the people of Ukraine? Like, is there something we would see outwardly and go like, okay, it's changing and they're winning enough where they can drive Russia to a negotiating table where hopefully that ends up being Russia just pulls out of the country? I mean, that's what you want, but it probably have to be a diplomatic discussion about that.
Yeah, so there are a number of things that can happen. And the most ideal situation is with Congress. And just to really put a pin on it, I don't see anything happening with the funding really. There are two things that can happen. Marjorie Taylor Greene threatened to call for a vacate on Mike Johnson. And so what that will mean is that in order for Mike Johnson to keep his seat, that he's going to have to caucus with Democrats. and I don't think that he has the appetite to do it. Now, the Democrats will do it if they get what they want from him, but he'll be pretty much a sitting duck, and he'll be a pariah within the Republican Party, and he'll lose whatever power and influence that he has within the MAGA contingency. So I don't think that he's going to go down that path, which leads to the second point, is that we may very well have to wait until November and just hope that the House, that the Democrats win the House and somehow win the Senate. And so in that case, what you want to see happening, and you know, as far as actions taking place for funding to be released early next year, and that will be a long time. What a visual will look like militarily is that Ukraine has all of the has Patriot systems all around the country to protect itself against the barrage of missiles and drones that Russia sends to it, because they're trying to bomb Ukraine into submission. Having the country full of Patriot missile systems and other air defense systems would definitely be helpful in that, and prevent Russia from feeling that they can just bomb them into submission. Number two, the addition of the artillery rounds, the further additions of tanks and the F-16s and other types of further training, and that would help. And then that would give the Ukrainians an added boost, so that they, you know, and also the long range missiles. So the Taurus systems, the ATACMS, that would go the full 300 kilometers. So that visual difference we would see in Ukraine that will result in them taking back their territory. But there's another thing that people are not really talking about, and that is the economic part of it. The United States has not done remotely enough to sanction Russia, particularly in the energy sector. And so you saw one of the assistant secretaries of defense saying that that Ukraine, she gave this really kind of BS excuse of why Ukraine should not target oil refineries because of citizens being harmed. And I don't believe that, simply because of the fact that what she also didn't say, or what's not being said out loud, is that will potentially drive up prices in oil that'll lead to fuel costs. And Biden is trying to run for president, and people could use the excuse the oil prices are going up because Russia's oil percentages are going up as well. And so that's a caveat. But ultimately, if we were to pressure Russia on the energy sector, you would see Russia having a very different response, because you're squeezing their ability to fuel their genocidal imperial war. But that would require us to have a moral consistency and integrity, and to digress from capitalism, which is a whole nother conversation that we really don't want to talk about. And if you bring me on the show, I'll break it down for you. But that's another caveat.
And I look forward to that, because my hostility towards the obscene wealth of the billionaires is growing. Yeah. And I talked about on the show this week, because Donald Trump had his meeting of his industrialists that had a little meeting and raised allegedly $50 million. And these rich people, they're not the MAGA rank and file. They know Trump attempted a coup. They know he wants to turn this into autocracy. And they know that Putin's oligarchs make more and more money and get wealthier and wealthier. So suck up to the autocrat. They will trade our democratic republic for more money. And it's unreal. Last 2 minutes here, and it's unfair to squeeze it, but 2 to 3 minutes. You know, you've been posting a lot about Gaza. You've just mentioned you went and visited in Palestine in the past. What is your take on it now? And when you're in Ukraine, does it get much coverage? Do people discuss it?
Yeah, so Ukraine is very much pro-Israel for a whole bunch of complex reasons I can't break down in these 2 seconds. But as far as the coverage, and albeit you have Ukraine that does recognize Palestinian statehood, yada yada yada. But as far as what's happening here in this country, I think that we really are really confronting what does it mean to be, and what does it mean to conflate anti-Semitism with challenging and critiquing the policies of Israel. And for the first time, what I'm starting to see is this major revolt against the well-oiled machine of Israeli lobby groups that have spent the decades saying that if you challenge anything that goes on in the state of Israel with our policies towards Gaza or towards the Palestinians, then there's anti-Semitism. And you have a lot of people who are afraid to speak out about it. But what we're seeing now is this deep self-reflection that has resulted in Palestinians exercising their power in this election. You see with the non-committed vote, and I think it's the best way to end it, is that the non-committed vote is saying something very simple. If you don't respect our bodies, if you don't respect our blood being shed, then we're going to use something against you that you really respect. If you don't respect our humanity, you respect power. And if you respect power, you respect this vote more than my body, then I'm going to threaten you with withholding my vote. And you know what? Damn good for them. I'm voting for Joe Biden. Let me be perfectly clear, because I don't want that. And I don't want that maniac in the Oval Office. But
I agree.
I have nothing but respect for people who say that if you do not respect my agency as a human being, but I can wield my vote as the only thing that you will respect, then that's fine. And I think that we really need to stop shaming these people for daring to exercise their agency in the way that as an only way for them to be respected, and spend more time putting the fire under Joe Biden's behind to make him change his policies. Because that's something, as a Black person, if we say we want qualified immunity, we want, for to be removed from police officers who are us, if we want all these other things in a form of policy, then how come these Arab Americans cannot have the same respect? And so what we're experiencing right now in this climate is we're seeing Arab Americans exercising their agency. And so you have this wide rainbow of people, of constituents that Joe Biden needs to respect, but he himself is not really personally really built to equip. And so the future for us is that if we are able to survive this demon that's running for office, whose name is Donald Trump, and he passes on, we really need to self-reflect on the Democratic side about the type of leadership that we need in order to represent the totality of the humanity that exists in our community, because Joe Biden is definitely not it.
Terrell, it's great chatting with you. And by the way, tomorrow we have Congressman Jamal Bowman on, who AIPAC has made one of their number one targets because of him speaking about Palestinian humanity.
What's up?
Terrell, I'll tell them what's up on him, Terrell. Terrell, if people want to sign up for your newsletter, Black Diplomats, where can they go?
Oh, go to So my newsletter is Black Diplomats. Go to Substack. Substack.com and search for Black Diplomats. You can subscribe, become a year-long subscriber for $60, but also go to my YouTube channel, Black Diplomats Official, where I post my podcast weekly. Go to any place where you hear podcasts, iTunes, it could be Spotify, wherever, and I talk weekly about foreign policy, especially Ukraine.
Thank you, my friend. Great chatting with you. Thanks and I'll chat with you sooner, more frequently. Thanks a lot, brother. Have a great night.